Okay, we are now at Notes 1.4. This is actually 2 pages that you should have, and so this will be a little bit longer video because I didn't want to cut it off in the middle of a concept. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the planes of the body and the body cavities and the serous membranes. So still talking about how the body is organized. So we talked in the previous video about directional terms and regions of the body, and so now we can look at the planes of the body. A plane is, and I'm talking about the geometrical definition of it, not that thing that flies in the sky, but a plane is a flat surface that can cut across any type of direction. So like if you have a circle or a square, you can have a plane, cut it at a certain region, but it's a flat, level surface. And so in our body, we have the frontal, we have 4 different major planes, but one of them can go lots of different ways. But they can go all the different directions, but they still will cut the body into the same portions. So a frontal or coronal plane is a vertical plane that will divide your body into anterior and posterior portions. So imagine yourself standing at anatomical position, and you have a plane that runs from your right arm to your left arm. It cuts it across and divides you into front and back portions. That is your anterior and posterior, or that's your frontal or coronal plane. The mid-sagittal plane will divide the body into right and left equal halves at the body's midpoint. So again, you're standing in anatomical position. If you put your finger on the very top of your head and just draw a line all the way straight the middle of your body all the way down, that would be the mid-sagittal plane. So it divides you into an equal right and left half. A sagittal plane still divides you into right and left parts, but it may not be equal. Mid-sagittal is the only one that is specifically just one plane that divides you into equal parts. You can have multiple sagittal planes dividing you into right and left parts, but it's not specific halves. That's what the mid-sagittal plane is. And then a transverse plane runs horizontally and will separate you into top and bottom portions, or superior and inferior portions. So when we're looking at frontal, sagittal, and transverse plane, there are multiple planes that can be done to cut you into pieces according to the definition of the plane. The only one there's only one of is the mid-sagittal, because it's equal right and left halves. Those are planes of the body. The next section, E, are the different body cavities that you have. And so we have, the first one is abdominal cavity. It contains the stomach, intestines, liver, spleen, gallbladder, pancreas, ureters, and kidneys. And that's a ventral body cavity, that's anterior. The cranial cavity, that's the cavity that's inside the skull or the cranium, and it contains the brain. So that's considered the dorsal body cavity, because you have more of your brain on the back side of your head, so that's considered dorsal or posterior. The pelvic cavity contains the urinary bladder, the urethra, the uterus, the other reproductive organs, male and female, part of the large intestine, and the rectum. So it's below the abdomen. It is ventral or anterior. The spinal cavity is the spinal column, contains the spinal cord and the bones that make up your spinal column, and that is dorsal, like your cranial cavity. You're still, this goes to the next page of your notes, and the next cavity here is thoracic. That contains the esophagus, the trachea, the lungs, the heart, and the aorta, and it can be divided by the mediastinum, and we'll talk more about that later, and that is a ventral body cavity. And this cavity we've already talked about, but below the diaphragm, that's your abdominal cavity. Okay, the last part of these notes are the serous membranes. So we have all these cavities. you have membranes that cover the cavity and also the organs that are in them. And we'll keep coming back to this and referring to this terminology. But if you're looking at the membrane that covers the organ, it's always going to be a visceral organ. That VISC root word means organ. So that would be the inner membrane. And then the parietal membrane is the one that always lines the cavity. So it's the outer part of the membrane. You're going to do a demonstration with a balloon on debrief day with this, where you can really see the difference between visceral and parietal membranes. But between these two membranes, there's a space, and that space is filled with fluid that's secreted by the membranes to reduce the friction. So there's always this organ that's being covered by the visceral membrane moves, and so as the organ moves, so will the membrane, and you don't want it rubbing up against the parietal membrane because that would be very painful. So there's fluid there to help keep things moving smoothly, and there's no friction between them causing you pain. Now, based on where these membranes are located and what organ they're covering, they'll have a different name. So for example, the one surrounding the heart is the pericardium, the pericardial cavity. So the heart, the membrane that's actually covering the heart, because this is the organ here, is the visceral pericardium. The membrane that surrounds or covers the cavity that the heart is in is the parietal pericardium. So it's a little confusing. You have to think about where it is and what's being covered. If the organ is being covered, you're going to use the visceral word. If the cavity is what's being covered, you're going to use the parietal word. And then you put either one of those words in front of these words to describe where it's at specifically. The lungs are in a cavity, and there's a membrane surrounding them and also around the lungs themselves. So the visceral pleura is the membrane covering the lungs themselves. The parietal pleura covers the lung cavity. The peritoneum is in the organs that are in the abdominopelvic cavity. So the visceral peritoneum covers the organs. The parietal peritoneum covers the cavity that the organs are in. So we'll be practicing this quite a bit because it is a little confusing. Okay, make sure you have your notes here. Your blanks filled in. The next sheet here is a picture of the planes. We talked about those planes before at the beginning of the video. So here is the transverse plane. It's cutting the person into top and bottom, superior and inferior portions. This plane right here is the sagittal because it's dividing the body into right and left sides. And then this plane right here is going across the front, so that's the frontal or coronal plane, dividing the body into anterior and posterior portions. This just shows you, if you're to cut the plane here, what part of the organs that you would see based on that plane. So when you're doing an MRI of the whole body, you can do a sagittal cut, a transverse cut, or a frontal or coronal cut, and they're talking about those planes, and that will determine what part of the organ that you're going to see when you look at the results of the scan. Here is a picture that shows you the different body cavities, and so your dorsal body cavities would be your cranial and your vertebral. Your ventral body cavities are going to be both the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. So thoracic is the purple here, and your diaphragm is here. That's the muscle that helps you breathe. And your abdominal cavity is the pink, and the pelvic is the green. So looking at the anterior view of that, you see this is your whole thoracic cavity. But this mediastinum is what I was talking about before. It's kind of like this middle portion that can divide it into different sections. And so you have your pleural cavity, which contains your lungs, your pericardial cavity, which contains your heart, and then your abdominopelvic cavity is this whole thing here. Here's another picture that shows the heart, the pericardial cavity. So the blue is the parietal pericardial membrane. The red is the visceral pericardial. It's actually the same membrane that just loops around, and then as it's covering the heart, it's just named a different thing. Okay, and then inside there is the space, the pericardial cavity that has the fluid in that, the pericardial fluid. So as your heart is pumping, again, you wouldn't want the membranes rubbing up against each other, so that fluid helps protect that from happening. Here is the same thing with your lungs, the pleural cavity. So it's the same membrane. If you go on the outer part, it's the parietal pleura, this blue line. But as you come in here, it's going to be covering the lung, the red line, and that's the visceral pleura. And so there's a space between them here containing fluid, pleural fluid. Okay, your turn. On the very first page of your notes 1.4, you're going to get these two sheets and take those in. The first sheet here is just your, this kind of goes back to the previous notes actually. We're going to be defining the meaning of each of these directional terms. So just use your notes from 1.3. And then here you're just drawing the different planes on these 4 different bodies. So you're just drawing a straight line. Use your rulers to make it nice and straight. So that's what you're going to do on the first page of Notes 1.4. On the left side of your second page of Notes 1.4, you're going to get this sheet, and then you're going to fill in the answers here. What are body cavities and how are they important? This is the 4 different cavities. You're going to list, name the cavity and then list the organs that are in each one. And this is the same picture from your notes in your book. And then what structure separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity? You're going to label it on this sheet and tell what the purpose of that is. When you put this in your book, just put it on one half of your sheet. You're going to do something else with the other half on debrief day. All right, that ends section 1.4 of this chapter 1 notes.